All right, guys, so we're going to get started on the next project, which is a magazine project. What we're going to do is you are going to design this year's edition of the Marietta College Pulse Literary Magazine. For this project, you are having the client, a student editor, Emily, who's going to come and meet with us and talk to us about the parameters of this project. A magazine is something that you often have to deal with a lot of type and image and figuring out how to fit everything in, still be visually engaging. So I'm going to give you a few tips and things that I want you to really consider when you start to do this project. One of them is you really need to create a modular grid. Now this grid could look like this, in which it's completely equal of columns and rows, and you're creating these squares ultimately, or it can be quite more dynamic than that. Anytime you look at any grid material or grid designs, you'll see that there's such a huge variety. In fact, you can even look at the book that I suggested, which is Grid Systems, as well as the book I provided with your class fee. When you do a modular grid, you really want to make sure you have proper margins. This allows it so that if you do have columns of text next to each other or an image in text, they don't look like they're too close together. In fact, they might even look complementary and equal, and that way you can actually see that everything is on a grid. If you're not good about creating margins, then it just looks like things are floating and you don't really realize that it's on a grid to begin with. One option that a lot of magazine designers, as well as book designers, basically in publication as well as newspapers, is they use a baseline grid. So you can kind of see how a baseline grid compares with and without. And this means that if you're actually moving text above and below and they're not exactly the same size, all that, they will still line up. And this is actually an option in InDesign in the paragraph style setting. So you can do this, and you can also establish where the grid lines are in the preferences for InDesign. So this is something to consider if you're dealing with a lot of type on one spread and it starts to look a little wonky. Next, when you deal with elements on the page and you're kind of establishing that grid and where elements might go, I really encourage you to use the rule of thirds. So that means that basically you have these grid lines, and that in the intersections of the grid, that's where you want to place something of interest to lead the eye. This helps you keep your layout from being a little too static. In fact, you can see a photograph here that's basically using this rule of thirds in the photograph to make it a little bit more engaging, and then also how someone might use it on layout design. So you have a header or pull quote pulling you down to the text below that you want them to read, then pulling you over to the images on the right. Another thing that's really important when you create a grid is that if you want to create emphasis or a great deal of impact, you need to break it occasionally. So that means that if you really want to create emphasis on a certain part, then break that grid and you'll start to notice this doesn't quite match with everything else. And it becomes a lot less static when you're flipping page to page. Because we know we do not want to get bored when we're flipping page to page, especially when you have primarily text on that page. So for example, this is a layout that has a consistent grid, but they still create variety in it. So you can see as it goes through that you have these angles. There's a certain method of icons and style that they use. The way they format the type is consistent, but switching it up page to page really helps create that variety. So you can see here how all these different grids all these different pages essentially have the same grid but different layouts to create that variety, but are also consistent. So the reader knows that they're actually flipping through the magazine, that they're looking at content and not advertising. So that's a big thing about magazines. They're full of so much advertising. If you don't make your design consistent, it will accidentally be misconstrued that your content is an advertisement or vice versa, which is a big thing you just wouldn't want to have happen. Also, when you work with this, you really should utilize your white space. So that negative space, those margins, are really going to help lead the eye. So don't try to shove too much onto a spread. Use that white space to engage the eye. And then you can see how that white space, you can really play off of it. You can use other elements, lines, for example, varying text sizes to really create some visual texture for that. So you do have a restriction, and that is most of this magazine will be black and white. A couple pages will be in color, the cover will be in color, but because of cost restrictions, you do have to deal with in grayscale. But that doesn't mean it has to be boring. You can look at these pages and realize this is all in black and white, and it's still visually engaging. So remember that. So what you need to do for the next step is getting started. We are going to meet with the editor at 2 p.m. So she's going to come and meet us in the lab, and I want you to compile a list of questions that you might have about the parameters of the project, anything between now and then. While you wait, and also for homework, you need to create 6 different grids for this magazine using the paper templates as part of your project brief. And what you're going to do is each page you're going to have one grid, and I want to see how you would do different layouts within that same grid per page. So you should have at least 6 different ones. You can print out more by printing from the PDF uploaded to Moodle that is part of this project brief. Then you need to create a type study. Decide what typefaces you want to use. And I really want you to print those typefaces in different sizes so you can actually determine what is a good size for the body text specifically, but sometimes the headers as well. So if you look at the project brief, I actually suggest you choose 3 different typefaces. One that might be more of a display typeface for a header, another that might work as a subtitle, and a header in some areas, but tends to be a little bit cleaner, more modern, and then a body text. So try to find 3 typefaces that really are compatible. Remember, there's lots of resources on the internet to look for compatible typefaces if you're not sure. And then I want you to print all 3 of those out at several different sizes to actually figure out what is an appropriate size for the body text. Compare that with existing magazines. So don't just look on the internet for inspiration and research. Be observant. There are magazines in the lab and books. There are magazines in the library. Notice the typical size of headers, of body text, etc., and take those cues when you are trying to design for your magazine. All right, so let's get started.